Hi, this is Beat It with Joe, and you're listening to Joe Mountford. This show is about mental health for athletes and coaches. The podcast is for athletes, up-and-coming athletes, and for all the staff who support them. As a Gallup strengths coach and therapist and mindfulness coach, I interview professional athletes, coaches, and those who are working with them. I believe that mental health is vital for performance. This includes the mental wellness of coaches, management, and players. My special guest today is Garreth Ewing, a former SA men's hockey coach. Garreth coached the men's hockey team from 2019 to 2022, taking them to the Tokyo Olympics and the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham. He also coached some FI8 proleague tournaments. He was definitely the man who grounded the team for the FI8 Pro League, winning for the taking them to 2024. Garreth was also the assistant men's coach in 2014 to 2018. Garreth is also a mental strengths coach, and together we've had some wonderful and meaningful discussions. Garreth and I will be running a series of podcasts focusing on the coach this time, the mental health of the coach, and how we can support them. In this episode, we focus on the role mental health has to play in the performance of the coach. We look at how we can better support the coaches so that they can perform optimally, as well as how to manage oneself out of competition. We introduce the topic of living more mindfully. And I am going to bring in our guest, Garreth Ewing. Hello, Garreth.
Hello, Joe. How are you doing?
I'm great, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you for your time. And I think the topic, talking about the mental health of the coach, is a topic that's maybe neglected. And we've had some fantastic discussions, and I think it's invaluable to share this information with others too. So I'm going to start by asking you, having coached at a professional level, what role do you think mental health has to play?
Look, it's got a massive role to play from a coaching point of view, because at the end of the day, however involved everybody else is in terms of players and management, the buck stops with the coach, and the coach as a leader is under immense pressure. And very seldom do they actually pay attention to their own mental health and even their own physical health. So we need to kind of open up these channels to make it something that is available to coaches, and also that just makes them be at their best. Because at the end of the day, if the coach isn't performing because of mental health burdens that they may often have placed on themselves, then it's going to ultimately cause the team to suffer at the end of the day.
Yeah. And the reality is things like pressure, the stress, anxiety, fear, performance anxiety, I mean, you feel it. That all stops with you. And I think as a coach, it's a little bit like being a CEO. You're on your own. You're expected to be totally in control and on it. And your support staff probably expect the same of you, and your players definitely. So when things go wrong, what do you think? What do you think people can do? Or if you had it all over again, what would you pass on to the next coach? What would be the message to the next coach? Like, how can we support you?
So I think the important thing is for the coach is not to isolate him or herself. You've got to be as inclusive as possible in terms of your management group, because they need to help you share the load. I think a mistake I definitely made was keeping things to myself, doing that to protect my staff, to be honest, to let them just focus on their main job. But what that ended up doing was that my job became burdensome, and there were so many distractions that I actually ended up not being my best self in that space. So the first thing I would do is make sure you're as inclusive as possible in terms of sharing that stress load, because your staff at the end of the day are supportive of you and they want you to do well. The second thing that I would focus on, which I think is really, really important, is creating a space where you can de-stress yourself. I know that's a terrible word, but to have a safe space where you can decompress, where you can disconnect from the day's stress, even if it's just for a few minutes. And that's something that's really important. That's something you can create yourself, but I do think there need to be some structures put in place to help coaches cope with these spaces.
Yeah, we've spoken about that before, and I think so many people don't have, let's call it mindfulness. They're not aware that they need that. And we're going to get into something shortly about that high performance space and then being able to sit in a non-exciting space. But let's talk, can we talk more personally in the sense of that we live in South Africa and maybe there's not a lot of money and sponsorships, and if you can maybe give the example you gave me yesterday is when you arrive at practice and you're wanting to be the best version of yourself and you have a plan, but you've come out of a meeting, and would you like to share that?
Yeah, I think it's something that comes up, and I think it's for most coaches, not just the ones of us who are struggling with finances within their federation, is you're pulled in so many different directions. So when it's time to fully focus on the players, for example, at a training session or in a team meeting, you may have just come from an extremely fractious interaction with an administrator, or there's a struggle around money or a struggle around facilities and logistics, and you're distracted and you're elevated, and then you arrive at training and you want to present your best self again to your team, and there's a huge drain on you to be what you need to be in that moment when you've just come from a very stressful situation and stuff that you maybe were not conditioned to look after and to learn about, on your developmental coaching journey.
Yeah.
Like in so many other leadership positions, you sometimes get to a position before you've acquired all the skills, and then you maybe don't have the resources around you from a support point of view. So it can be very difficult to come into a session and switch off from what happened before so that you can give of your best. And the more often those situations happen, the harder it can be.
Yeah.
And it ends up making it harder for you to sell your process to your players. And obviously it's a drain on you emotionally.
Yeah. And I think we've spoken about this before. I mean, your role extends way beyond performing on the field. I mean, I think you had to raise money to get balls, and it turns out to be the coach's role to look for sponsorship. And so the reason I'm sharing that is that you've only got a certain amount of energy. When your mind is performing optimally, you've only got a certain amount of energy. And that energy is hopefully, in the best case scenario, being spent in the performance of the players. So if you're being drained in all other directions, that optimal energy that you have becomes less. So what you can give to your team is less. And on your very depleted resources, it's incredible what you were able to achieve with that team. I mean, it is incredible. But I think it's important for you to share that you ultimately ended up with depression, and your emotions were on a cement level, let's call it that, a concrete level, where you weren't enjoying the wins. You didn't care about the losses, but there was nothing. You were depleted, burnt out.
Absolutely. And if I reflect on it, and having spoken to other coaches and other people in leadership positions, is again that strain of wanting to be the best and do the best for the people that you are serving. You put yourself in the way of every single problem, and you put yourself in the way of every single situation. And because ultimately the accountability is with you and you feel responsible for the people around you, I put myself in that space too regularly, and I was striving to maintain an emotional equilibrium, not overreacting too much one way or the other. And I know I didn't always get that right, but ultimately what it became is it became a numbing process, because I was trying so hard to be consistent and trying so hard to be dependable and accountable that it became a burnout situation, and it became a survival situation more than somewhere where I could, speak out and express myself. And it either would become this hugely elevated space where I would absolutely lose my shit, for want of a better word, or more often than not, I would just be completely shut down to it until I couldn't pick myself up consistently anymore. So a very difficult situation, classic burnout, which I think many people have experienced in the last 3 or 4 years, and people are becoming more aware of. But I experienced all of those symptoms until I did indeed descend into a depressive state.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. But I think if anybody from federations are listening to this, the knock-on effect of what happens, and you would agree, say you come out of a elevated, as you described it, elevated situation where your mind is, I call it like in a snow globe, where your thoughts are just chasing all over the place. And then you enter the space of the hockey field, because that's where you would go. And your players are then unsure because they don't know if you are going to be happy, calm, crazy. They're not sure what coach is bringing to the party on that day. So immediately their focus is taken off their purpose, because they're not sure of the impact that what their behavior is going to have on the coach and what the coach is going to have on the practice. So the knock-on effect is all about taking away from our outcome. It's all about taking away from what we're here to achieve because of unnecessary things. But if we had more awareness, if we had more support, if we were able to reach out for help, all those little things that you've realized now, I think may help other people so that they can be the best version of themselves to help a team perform.
Look, I'd like to think so. If there's any message that I've spoken to people about and shared, is that this is not unique to me, and challenges around stress and burnout and mental health are prevalent, and that we all need to be aware of them. And I think from an administrative point of view is understanding, the assets that you manage as an administrator of a federation, and that includes your coaching staff.
Yeah.
And that if you ask too much of them too consistently, eventually they're not going to be able to do their core job, which is helping perform. Yeah. And I think we've all been in that space where we're in a meeting space, and somebody walks in and they come in and they're like under a cloud. The body language and the way you see that person immediately tells you that they're elevated and they're not going to be in a good space. And that changes the whole mood of the room. And the coach is responsible for the mood of the team. And it's something to be aware of. I think that there's a huge conversation to be had about what are support structures for coaches and managers. Yes, we are very aware of players, and I think we're learning a lot and we're growing in that space, but we're not as aware of what coaches and leaders need as much as we are about the players. And I think it's something to start paying attention to and having more conversations about.
Yeah. And I even think as a management team, it's having that conversation within the team, just checking in. And even if you can't help the people around you, then it's being able to help them to reach out where they need to get it. And, so much focus is on exercise and breathing and nutrition and mental health of athletes, but that needs to apply to the coaches too. I mean, simple skills that we've shared are breathing techniques to help you when you're in the moment to engage the parasympathetic nervous system, and those are tools that are accessible to everybody, and it's something that you can learn to control at any stage. But I'm saying is that the management need the tools just as much as the players.
They do, absolutely. And I think what happens is this is a global phenomenon in all sports coaching, is the coach neglects themselves. in the interests of supporting everybody else. And they're actually not aware of the fact that they need those tools until it's too late. Yeah. And I think you'll find some of the most successful coaches globally are the ones that are very self-aware and are able to manage their stress responses effectively. And it's something for us all to be aware of. I can talk from my own experience of breathing exercises and journaling being really, really important to me. And more recently, using exercise. And I don't like the term coping mechanism because I understand where it's coming from, but it does have a little bit of a negative connotation. It's more just being aware of yourself and understanding your own needs and being in touch with yourself, your mind and your body. And those things have been really important for me. As I said, if I could repeat things.
Tuning in to your body, tuning into your mind. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And then again, being more comfortable to share within my management team, not always feeling the pressure to project leadership and project problem solving. Yeah. Would have been a lot more helpful in retrospect. But when you're in the moment, when you're in that survival state, it's a lot more difficult to even be aware of your outside world. You're just completely focused on surviving in your own space.
And if I can say, I think you got to a point where asking for help wasn't even a consideration. It was reaching out, and I'm talking about your assistant coaches and those around you. Because depression is set in, the world becomes a bit narrow. So the thought of reaching out to the people that are right there, it wasn't available in your, like, it wasn't available because you didn't think to do that.
Absolutely, it was there, but I couldn't see it anymore.
Yeah.
And I think it also probably eroded trust to a certain extent because, again, my staff weren't always sure what they could expect of me or from me. But they could obviously see that I was in difficulty. So yes, it became a very difficult space. And it's something to be aware of. If you find yourself in a space of burnout and depression, is to ask for help or to find help. And that is easier said than done. But everybody will reach a point, touch wood, where you can find that space. But you have to find it, otherwise you can get into even more serious trouble.
And Garreth, would you be able to share what symptoms of burnout felt like?
So there were two aspects of it for me. There was this hyper aroused state that I would get into in competition, where I was super aware of everything going on around me and feeling very, very in control and thinking that I was high functioning. And for lots of time I was. The problem was I would stay in that space, and it would become harder and harder for me to come back down from it. So when I did come back down, I would go completely the other way, and I would just want to hide and retreat into myself, and my motivation levels and my ability to respond emotionally to anything just went away.
Yeah. So it was like that. Adrenaline pump, like in your hyper aroused state, it was like being on a serious pump of adrenaline. So as you say, in the dugout, in the competition, in the tournaments, and then it's the serious slide down to fatigue, lack of emotion, lack of motivation, maybe feelings of hopelessness,
Very much so, and also just feeling like I couldn't get around to everything anymore, and I was almost exercising triage of what was important and what was going to get my energy, and that little portion of tasks was getting smaller and smaller and smaller as my motivation and my energy declined.
Yeah.
So I mean, even assessments that I did pointed out that I would just look at a set of tasks and go, you know what, I'm not doing those. I'm not even going to try. I'm going to focus on these two, and that's as good as it's going to get.
Okay. So admin seemed like an Everest.
Admin seemed like an Everest. Basic daily tasks just fell by the wayside. I always make a morbid joke about, I've just finished tournament, now I must go and do groceries. And that stuff just stopped. They just stopped. And then it became this obsession with the next tournament, the next event, the next athlete interaction at the expense of everything else, because I didn't have enough energy for everything else. There was no more balance.
No, and the impact lands on your family, right? You know, that's where the not so great person arrives, through the front door. And that is going to be, I'm not going to get into that today. That's going to be a follow-up podcast where we're going to talk about the link between both the professional athlete and you as the coach, how you experience. It's like an addictive state. So you're chasing that high, and it's that extreme pump that you experience, and then there's the nothing. And then there's the chase, and all the symptoms and the behaviors are very similar to addictive behaviors. So we're going to talk about at a later stage, finding a balance. And it's very hard to be balanced as an elite athlete, but it is in the downtime. It's about finding balance and trying to be still with yourself and being okay with a mundane, boring life that most of us live, and, you know, that stuff. So that's going to be a topic we'll discuss in, I think, our third podcast, because I think it's really, really relevant. But I think it's awesome and courageous to be able to share your truth, because I promise you, when other people listen to that, they're going to go, yeah, that's me.
Well, I hope so. It's something that has been with me for longer than I've been willing to admit, and it's important for people to understand, not just people in leadership positions, it's everybody really, that mental health challenges and issues around stress and burnout are things that we must be upfront about. And I actually think the younger generation should be acknowledged for the fact that they're much more open to speaking about their challenges than people of older generations, and we should respect that and take heed of it.
Yeah. I worked in addiction for many years, and I did talks on substance abuse. And I said to parents, if we could give our children an emotional vocabulary, if they were able to express how they're feeling, they wouldn't necessarily search for substances to shift that feeling, to try and get rid of that feeling. So Garreth, if there were coaches out there who are listening to this, who recognize themselves that maybe they have got symptoms of burnout or are really struggling, what steps do you think they can take to reach out or to stop the slippery slide?
Look, I think the first thing to acknowledge is that it's very difficult once you've started to slide to slow yourself down. So it's really important to stay in tune with yourself as much as possible, so that you can recognize the symptoms before they become overwhelming. And this is why it's really important in our daily lives to be mindful of ourselves and where we are and how we're feeling, and learning to articulate those feelings internally, and sometimes to other people, but we've got to be in touch with ourselves. Once that slide starts, it's hard to halt it until you get to the bottom.
I think journaling helped you with that, identifying that, am I right?
Very, very much so.
Scaling your emotions 1 to 10, where you're at on that day, writing a few, okay?
I mean, I journaled, and I actually realized I've been feeling a little unsettled the last few days, and it's because I haven't been journaling and I haven't been recording my sensations. So it actually felt good to go back to that when I did it this morning. And it's finding, you have to find space where you can speak to somebody. You'll find, maybe you'll be lucky and you'll still be able to want to exercise, and you'll want to, find your space in the day where you're just by yourself and you're just quiet. But it becomes harder and harder. It's really important to keep communicating with people and find the person that you can be safe with. It might be a spouse, it might be a close friend, it could also just be a coach. And by coach, I mean, a performance coach, somebody who can help you work through these spaces all the time. And again, for me, before you need that deep intervention, is to be aware of yourself before it starts to slip. And I hope that's something that perhaps that's my biggest message out of these conversations is to have that awareness early before it gets too late.
Because I think when one is depressed, when someone says to you, go out, have a walk and exercise, it seems, again, like a mountain too high. It just, the motivation, the energy levels, all of that is really hard. And then when we're feeling really low, it's even harder to reach out for help, to get a psychologist, a therapist, even call a friend for a coffee. So, those are real symptoms, and they're totally real.
I think to add to that, Joe, is it's also important to understand that even the smallest thing can make a difference. Yeah. So if an extreme example is just get out of bed, to do something, to feed the dog, but find the small thing that you can do and celebrate doing that, because
to get your energy moving
becomes easier and easier and easier. The more often you do small little things, eventually the big things don't seem as intimidating.
Absolutely. And something you said before, and I think just general public and friends could hear this, but when you're so involved in one sport, sometimes when you sit down and have a coffee with somebody, all you don't want to talk about hockey. Yeah?
Yeah, it's hard because it becomes quite, your friends are interested in what you do because obviously you're a sports coach and you do something interesting, and that's their hobby. And it stopped being a hobby for many of us who reach a higher level. And it is something you got to have conversations about other things. You've got to have interests of other things. And I actually read something this morning that you've got to have spaces outside of your primary interest to be aware of and to do things where you can just disengage. I'm actually doing an art class at the moment, which is, I'm awful at art, but it's completely different to what I normally do, and it takes me out of myself. And that's just one example. There are many things. It could be, if you're lucky enough, it could be as simple as going for a walk. Yeah. But to take yourself out of yourself, have a conversation about different things that doesn't involve online activity as well. That stuff can be important because it's just the pause. It's the pause you need to reconnect with yourself.
Fantastic. I love it that you're doing art. I think it just takes your brain in another area. But also what you said is so relevant. I remember having something else outside of the sport that you're performing in. I remember when our SA ladies went to, I think it was Tokyo, I think it was that, and they didn't perform very well. And for those coming back to coach hockey, to be only playing hockey, it was a dark space. It was very hard to go from that back into same and no different. For those of them who had a different job, a different interest, I don't know, I can see some people on social media playing paddle as well as that. It's something else. So at least your interest and your stimulation is activated elsewhere. So thank you for sharing that, because I think it's fantastic. Even with the golfers that I work with, I say, what other hobby have you got? What else can you do when you're not playing hockey, playing golf? So thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
But I think let's end there, Garreth, because our next podcast will be about the coach and the player, and looking at that genuine relationship and looking at trust and how you develop that trust but again, it's all about the mental health, the performance, understanding your players, talking on the same wavelength. And then our third podcast is going to be looking at the link to the addictive high performance thinking. So thank you for your time. And
thank you very much. Really awesome. Really, really awesome.
Thank you, Garreth. This is the first podcast in the series. If you'd like to send a message to the podcast to be included in future podcasts, please click on the link in the bio. This podcast is free, and you can support it by subscribing to Beat It With Joe on the YouTube channel. You can also support by subscribing and sharing this podcast on your social media platforms. If you would be interested in sponsoring a podcast, please either DM Beat It with Joe, otherwise email joelloyd@per4m.co.za. The Beat It with Joe podcast is for general information purposes only and does not constitute the practice of psychology, psychiatry, dietetics, or other health professionals. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Hi, this is Beat It with Joe, and you're listening to Joe Mountford. The show is about mental health for athletes and coaches, and all the support staff and those who are passionate about player wellness. As a Gallup strengths coach, therapist, and mindfulness coach, I interview professional athletes, coaches, and all those who are working with them. I believe that mental health is vital for performance. This includes the mental wellness of coaches, management, players, and parents. So subscribe now to stay connected. I'm fortunate enough to have Garreth Ewing joining me for the second week. He was a former SA men's hockey coach. Garreth coached the men's hockey team from 2019 to 2022, taking them to the Tokyo Olympics, the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham, and some FIH Pro League tournaments. We last spoke about mental health of the coach, where Garreth shared his own journey. You can listen to this or watch it on the Beat It with Joe YouTube channel. So I'm now going to bring in Garreth. Welcome, Garreth.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, thank you for joining me again. I was just saying that the last time we spoke, we were talking about mental health for the coach. And today we're going to be talking about the relationship between the coach and the players, which I think is a vital formula for success.
Absolutely. And I think that relationship is a special one, and it can potentially be a fragile one. So it's also something to really consider, and within the wider mental health context is obviously also really, really interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So on that, if I were to ask you, what unhealthy habits do you think coaches tend to, if things are not going well and if they're under huge pressure, how do you think it can be a negative response, or it can develop a negative relationship?
Coaches have to be careful of playing a blame game, either blaming themselves too much, or worse, probably blaming players, and then kind of, projecting their frustrations onto the player, whether that's with unkind words or a negative selection reaction, or a knee-jerk reaction in terms of what you're now going to train and what you're going to follow through, and leaving the process behind and trying to fix things in the short term. So, keeping the emotions there, because emotion is part of sport, but keeping it in check and not letting it take over the situation.
Yeah. So I think what you're saying is vital. So if the coach is mentally healthy, they will have a variety of emotions: happy, glad, sad, excited, angry, grumpy, stable. If the coach is not in a good mental space, is there a chance of, I call them, having concrete emotions where you can come across as a bit dead? Emotionally numb. Let's call it emotionally numb rather than dead.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of that comes down to how connected you feel to the process. So if your survival mechanism in that particular stress moment is to retreat,
or to try not to overreact, you could end up becoming emotionally stunted in that space. And then it becomes harder and harder for you to express yourself. And then the athlete starts to see you as shut down, and then they become colder and colder to you, and you lose that trust relationship. Trust can be built, takes months to be built, but it can disappear in an instant. One thought or action. So I think that idea of, as you say, concrete emotions getting stuck in a loop of negativity or retreat makes it harder and harder then to communicate and problem solve as a group.
Yeah. So I think it's the lack of accessibility to you as a coach. So if the player doesn't feel that you're accessible, then it creates a bigger gap. And if the coach is not emotionally stable or consistent, it also provides anxiety and an unsafe space for the team.
Yeah, I think that there's two extremes. There's the extreme of the coach having these over-the-top emotional responses where everything's a disaster and everything is finger pointing and blaming other people, and then going the other way where the coach is unapproachable and unengaged. And in fact, in both spaces, the coach becomes unapproachable because the response is going to be out of proportion. To keep that consistency, to keep that accessibility is sometimes very difficult, but it's extremely important.
Yeah. Okay. So my next question, or I was going to say, we spoke about last week that, say you came back from a meeting and you've been loaded with negative news or something that's going to carry heavily on you. And so we know that players are both listening and watching you. And so how do you think that energy impacts the practice, their performance, their sense of security?
Yeah, I think there's two elements at play there. The first one is the simple response to your body language, tone of voice, what kind of mood you bring to training, whether you're under a cloud or whether the sun is shining in your eyes. That can be really important. And obviously, if you come in with tension, that's going to create tension in the group. Linked to that as well, I think, and the second point is that communication is so important. And if they look at you and they think, well, you must have just got some bad news, they're going to start to assume negative things and they're going to assume the worst. And it becomes an obstacle in terms of communication, because perhaps it's something you do want to speak about, but you don't want to do it now because you don't want to make the mood even worse. So you end up, holding it in and carrying it around during the training session. And again, that affects the mood. So again, people are always listening to you. You're always the coach and you're always coaching. So even if it's at breakfast or it's off the pitch and they see you in a negative frame of mind or negative body language, that is going to rub off on them. And it's probably one of the hardest things to do. For me personally, it was, as a coach, is not to carry that around in a space where players can pick up on it. Sure.
And I think we spoke about it last time too, is developing self-awareness. It's being connected to your body and connected to your mind on how you're feeling, so that you know how you present yourself, or that you need to debrief somewhere else, or whatever the case may be. But having self-awareness gives one choice. And then another thing I think we can share, both being Gallup Strengths coaches, doing the Clifton Strengths so what happens is, just so that the listeners can hear it, is the team members do their strengths. And what that does is it gives the coach and a better understanding on how the players can be the best versions of themselves. You spoke about communication earlier on. If the coach has also done his Clifton Strengths, the team members understand how the coach can be the best version of themselves. And it just opens up communication channels on a much clearer level. What do you think about that as a coach yourself? As a Clifton Strengths coach yourself?
Look, I'm a huge fan of Clifton Strengths, and I think the most important thing in this team sport context is it gives everybody a deeper understanding of how the individual operates and how the individual operates within the team. My colleagues, Mick Todd, he always says, high-performing individuals are not well-rounded, but high-performing teams are, because you fill in each other's gaps. And you round out each other's spikes. And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it, and just that understanding of what each individual brings to a space. And obviously it's not always that easy when you're dealing with a large number of people, but being able to identify, well, this is what this person is going to bring to the table when they're not at their best. This is where they're going to be struggling, and this is how I can fill in the gaps for them. And that becomes really powerful. And it's just really a tool of creating a deeper knowledge of each other as a team. Really powerful, something for people to do some research into. It's just another way of building the trust and creating a space where people can thrive.
Yeah. So I had the opportunity to work with the SA Ladies team, and what we did, which was so amazing, is we broke up into little groups. And what it does is it allows you to communicate to others your why. This is the way I behave, and this is the reason why. And it's in that miscommunication that attention is lost. One loses focus on the goal. So, but what's also important, we're talking about player, team, and coach. It's the coach, therefore, understands why players behave the way they do and how to get the best out of them on and off the pitch.
And I think there's two aspects to that. There's the self-awareness aspect, where you are understanding your strengths or your lesser strengths, and how that impacts on you as a person in specific situations. And then obviously the greater team knowledge, where you understand how and where you fit in. And those two things working together are really important, because it also really contributes a great deal to the trust environment, in terms of understanding that sometimes what you see from somebody is not them being deliberately obstructive or aggressive. It's just how they respond based on how they are wired. Yeah. And that understanding is something that, again, when I have the opportunity to do this again at a high level, I'm definitely going to build this into my trust building framework.
Yeah, you mentioned the word trust quite often. That's a huge part of your coaching philosophy, am I right?
Very much so. From the point of view of creating an environment where everybody feels safe and part of a greater process, and also in terms of being able to and willing to show vulnerability to each other in terms of how you communicate with each other and how you express your feelings. It's an interesting process. Did I always get it right? No, but it was always something I was striving for, and the moments of clear trust that we did get right, it was very obvious to see and very powerful.
Wow. Yeah, because it creates a secure environment. And I think you bring up something, and in a man's world, and not a man's world, in a man's team, I think vulnerability is often frowned upon. And I think it's in being vulnerable that people can grow and develop and accept and be closer.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the the lessons that I learned is that it's really got to be worked at. Doesn't always come naturally, and it's very fragile. So trust, as I said, can be eroded very quickly, whether that's through a willful action or an inadvertent action or word. It's something you've got to work at, and you've got to understand its process. I was very lucky to have some really good professionals in the mental and performance space working with me on this, and it was conversations that we had over and over again. And I think that, again, there are times when it was very successful, and there are times when we realize we have to keep working at it. But it's got to be that human element coming through over and over again.
Yeah. But Garreth, it's everybody's responsibility to work on it. Do you agree? So
100%.
yeah. So when I say that if the coach is out of control and he's the role model and he's losing it on the side of the field, then it makes it okay for the players to also be losing it on the field, and then you get cards, etc., so that the knock-on effect impacts the team. So everybody needs to be heading in the same direction with the same responsibility. Yeah.
Agreed. Just the same as one player can erode trust in a whole group if he doesn't bring that buy-in. The coach as well can erode that trust if they're not consistent and regulated in terms of their response to situations, and understanding where the energy goes and what that energy looks like to people in the dugouts and people on the field and people up in the stands. So yeah, it's a very fluid situation, but you're 100% right. It's got to be everybody all the time.
Yeah.
And as much as we said earlier, understanding people are going to have their ups and downs, and the trust that people will always come up again is important to know, but it's got to be consistently applied all the time, even if it's not something that you're feeling at any given time, or it's not something that you feel 100% behind in any moment. You've got to keep working at it until it becomes a bit more natural.
Yeah. And I think one area that can break trust is not break trust, but maybe rattle a relationship is, I'll give you an example. I know someone who is in the SA team now, and she eventually went to her coach at school and said, "Why do you never say to me, congratulations, well played?" And her coach said, "Because you always play well." And so my question to you is going to be around expectations. So is it possible to give attention equally? And I'm sure the answer is no. And then the expectation is like, if they are that good, are there expectations to compliment them or not? Or what are your expectations? Do you know what I mean? And you understand what I'm saying? It's like, okay, first question is, are you able to give players attention equally?
So I think it's an interesting example that you use there, and it's something I'm really engaging with at the moment, is how you give praise and why you give praise, and what words you use. And something that I've been learning about a lot recently is the power of noticing. So I noticed that you did this really well in the game. I noticed that you slapped the ball really well during the game, as opposed to going, well played. Give somebody a little bit more focus, and it's a little bit more specific, and it gives them a message that you were genuinely seeing them. You weren't just giving a generic response. That said, I still think err more on the side of too much praise than too little. But again, that becomes quite difficult when humans are essentially wired for negativity. It's a survival mechanism. So we're looking for things through a jaded lens rather than looking at them massively positively all the time. So it's a tough one. I know I've been guilty of doing exactly that. You praise the players you consider to be your top performers in different ways to the players that you think are going to benefit a little bit more from a little bit of a pick-me-up or a push. So I think it is hard to give equal attention, but I think if you're very mindful about it, then you can be better at spreading the praise and spreading the encouragement around, but it takes work.
Yeah. And I think it's a conversation that needs to be had with each player. So it's that expectations conversation. So from the player's point of view, having the conversation with the coach, these are my expectations of you. And then the coach saying the same conversation back, because it's the same conversation about if you're in the starting lineup or not. Some people, if they feel that they're at their best in the starting lineup and then suddenly they're not, these are the conversations that'll either make or break confidence for some. But when I talk about those expectations, you gave the best when you said, I won't compliment a fish for swimming. How does that saying go?
Yeah, don't praise a fish for swimming. And it does come across as a little bit cynical as well. But at a high performance level, there's an expectation of a certain level of performance. And to praise a person for performing at the level, for me, is potentially a waste of energy, rather than giving energy where praise is going to improve that performance, or to mark out something that was done really, really well in a particular moment. Mm-hmm. So it's a tough one. I'm not sure in my current frame of mind that I would necessarily use that sentence as often as I perhaps would have in the past. But it's interesting because, again, depending on your level, there's an expectation of performance. Yeah. And a lot of it comes down to communication, and, as you say, an understanding of that expectation. And I think there's another thing I would do differently, is I was quite good, I believe, at telling the athlete what I expected of them, but I don't think I often enough said, what do you actually need from me? What can I give you to help you meet these expectations? So that's a process I'm engaging with in my head, and something that, again, when I get this opportunity, I'm going to modify and learn from. But, yeah, expectations are huge. And again, talk about communication, but what I say and what the player hears are sometimes two very different things.
Yeah, and I think if we go back to Clifton's strengths and we look at someone, if they have achiever in their top 5, and you look at that, they would benefit hugely if they set goals per practice. And if they were able to have that conversation with you in the practice, saying, listen, this is my intention for the practice, and I'd like to try and achieve them. Please, can you be on board just to help me, not being needy and like trying to be the favorite or anything, but again, just communicating that to you, and then you having the awareness to help them achieve that. It's those simple things that it creates a two-way channel of communication, and that you're all on the same page, heading in the same direction. I think it's really helpful.
Absolutely. And I also think there's this connection that gets created around that as well, because it's in the moment, it's real time, and that's it's personalized, and that becomes really important. Yeah, that's, again, another advantage to using a strengths-based approach, just in terms of understanding what people need and understanding when they're not at their best. I mean, again, the basement of achiever is going to be win at all costs, and I'm going to sacrifice everything to get this right, and that's not necessarily good in a team context, especially at a training situation. So understanding where the player may fall down is also useful in terms of helping them be aware of where they are and how they can stay engaged on where they need to be in terms of what the team needs at that moment.
And managing their expectations. Garreth, in a tournament, so say you're away on tournaments, if it's locally or away, what is a legitimate stress relief for a player, and what is not?
So, I mean, that's a really good question, Joe, because you're away for a long time, you're in relatively confined circumstances, you're in a very routine-driven space, and rest and recovery are really important, and that's both physical and mental. So players do need, or athletes and coaches do need a way of finding and creating some space, recharging their batteries. The question, I think, is that it's unique to everybody. Everybody's going to have their own way of doing things. We've spoken about athletes who like to stay in their room with the curtains closed and relax and be alone in the dark. You've got players who like to take an Xbox with them on tour and play games and get little syndicates of gaming going and Then you have athletes who actually like to find more exercise to get themselves in tuned based on what they do in their normal routines. You have guys who like to explore. You have guys who like to socialize with friends from other teams and that kind of thing. And all of those things are legitimate and understandable. The question is, when does it start to impact on the team, and when does it start to impact on the individual? So too much of anything isn't a good thing. Locking yourself in your room and keeping the lights off for 14 days of a tournament is not healthy. Going for a coffee 4 times a day is not healthy. Playing tourist all the time is not healthy. So it's a question of what works and what doesn't, and it's all about balance at the end of the day. And it's also a reminder that at the end of the day, you are there to perform and you're there to compete. And you need to be doing everything to give yourself the best chance of doing that, including what you do in your leisure time.
And I think that's, again, about the boundaries and the commitment and the sacrifice that one needs to make for the team, for the common outcome of the team. So I don't know, but is it the responsibility of the coach to set the boundaries with the players, or suggest boundaries with the players, or just bring awareness to what's healthy and what's unhealthy and what's suggested, or guidelines, or I'm not sure? What would your approach be?
I think there needs to be an informal contract in terms of treating people like adults, especially if they are adults, of course. We're talking about senior national players here, and letting them agree on what is and isn't allowed. I've often said, you know what, if you don't want to have dinner in the hotel tonight and you want to go and have dinner with a friend or with your folks or whatever it might be, 100% fine. Just let us know in advance. I would also rather set the boundary in terms of saying, today is a day when we're going to spend the whole afternoon feet up in our rooms, watching video and relaxing. Tomorrow is the day when we can get out, stretch our legs, go for a walk. So I think it's built into your schedule, it's built into your routine, and it's built into a respectful environment.
Yeah.
And I've even in the past said to a player who's feeling a little bit down on himself, or if it's a special occasion or he's remembering something, that if you want to go and have a beer, but don't have 5, have one, have it respectfully, and then carry on with your normal routine.
But Garreth,
boundaries and expectations.
Yeah, and I like the contract because it's sitting down with the player and doing a contract together, which means they're in on it and they therefore take responsibility for what you've agreed.
Yeah,
okay,
absolutely.
But Garreth, thank you so much for your time. And our next interview, we're going to cover the stress response and what it looks like for the high performance athlete, high performance coach, and how to manage that better.
Awesome. Sounds good.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks so much, Joe. See you soon.
Okay. Cheers, Garreth. Thank you. Bye. This was the second podcast or video recording. So if you would like to send a message to the podcast or to be included in future podcasts, please do so. This podcast is free and you can support it by subscribing to Beat It with Joe, and it's BEET, so Beat It for the Beetroot, on the YouTube channel. You can also support by subscribing and sharing this podcast or YouTube video on your social media platforms. If you would like to sponsor a podcast, please do so, and you'll find all the information below in the podcast. The Beat It with Joe podcast is general information purposes only and does not constitute the practice of psychology, psychiatry, dietetics, or any other professional health.